It's week 52 of 2017, but rather than just look at this week, we're going to look back at the entire year in review, take a look at some stories from earlier in the year and see how they've evolved. That's all coming up on the ITProTV podcast, starting right now. Hello and welcome to the ITProTV podcast. I'm your host, Peter Van Rysdam, joined as always by Don Pizzette. Don, how you doing?
Hey, I am doing great. Ready to wrap up this year, so we should have a fun episode.
Yeah, this is actually the year in review episode. We've been kind of doing the weeks in review with the news as it comes up each week, but figured with this 52nd week of the year, 2017, let's go ahead and just recap the whole year for those of you that may have missed it. It was a good one. It was a good year.
Yeah, and I think it's fun to take some of the topics that were like huge in the news for a few weeks and then disappeared, to follow up and kind of see where things are now. And because this is the first time we've done it, so I have to look at just this year. In the future, we'll be able to look at each year's episodes and kind of revisit that back and find out what's going on. Because there's a lot of times where something gets picked up by the media and you hear everything there is to know about it at that time, but then the next big thing comes along and the news moves along and you stop hearing about these things in the past. So we'll get a chance to revisit some of those. We've got some interesting things that were interesting the first time we heard them, but some others that turned out to be a lot more interesting than we thought as the year went on. So we'll recap all that right here and get a chance to see what happened.
Yeah, and the biggest thing this year, obviously, is us starting this podcast, but that was only about 6 months or so ago. So some of these aren't necessarily things we covered when they originally happened, but definitely interesting to look at them now in perspective with a little bit of time passed. And the first one is actually one of the things that we did cover just a couple of weeks back, and that would be net neutrality. There's been a lot of advancements or regressions, I don't know, in net neutrality over this year and the last couple of years. But we had a big announcement just a few weeks back here, and that was, what did you call it? A resolution of disapproval.
Yeah. So, net neutrality, at first glance, it appeared to just be a U.S. only problem. Like, it only affects USA. But really, because there's so much infrastructure here, it affects everybody all over the world. And so as that net neutrality vote happened, you saw people reporting on it everywhere. You just could not avoid information on it. Unfortunately, it was repealed. And so the rules that protected just data traffic across the internet are now kind of gone. It doesn't mean that it's the end of the world, right? The internet did not shut down the next day, which is good. And Congress is now making a move towards what they call a resolution of disapproval, which kind of shows the sad state of our society when we actually have a formalized process for disapproving of something. You used to just give it a nasty look and maybe call it some names, but now you got to fill out paperwork. So they're going to do that, and apparently if they do it, then the FCC has to basically reapply net neutrality. So we may see this one again in 2018. The odds are we actually will. They didn't get a chance to vote on it before they went to recess for the winter holidays. So we'll see in spring when things pick back up and where that goes. It'll be another one to follow, but definitely probably the biggest news story of 2017.
Yeah, and even if it does move forward with net neutrality, there's a lot of steps that need to happen between now and you having to buy the ITProTV podcast package, which you need to go ahead and contact your local cable or internet provider about that. But there's going to be a lot of steps with how that actually rolls out. I mean, you've already seen some little inklings of things that, T-Mobile includes your Netflix with your package or things like that where you can see the slippery slope where things are kind of moving in that direction. But like Don said, there's some time left in this one where things could definitely change, and I figure there will be a lot of back and forth. And it's been interesting to see some of the reactions of other countries going out of their way now to make more net neutrality rules and put things in place that kind of are the exact opposite of what's being done in the U.S. So we'll see how it all plays out. But the next big thing that was big talk of this last part of the year really is Bitcoin. And we actually did the last podcast, we had an expert come in and chat with us about Bitcoin, really the technology behind it and blockchain and how all those things fit together and cryptocurrency in general. So that's a really good one. If you don't know what we're talking about at all, definitely go back and watch that one. But you've got it listed on the rundown here today as the rise of Bitcoin. And since we did that podcast, we've seen the fall of Bitcoin, which I mean, if you started at the beginning of the year, you're still better off than you were.
Absolutely, yeah.
But you're less happy than you were right before Christmas.
And as a tech person, this seems like a fluff topic, right? But it was an item that kept popping up over and over again all throughout the year. Bitcoin was on our radar early in the year because of all the rise in ransomware. We'll talk about that in a minute. And Bitcoin was the typical payment for the ransom of ransomware. But towards the end of the year, it all became focused on how it's increased in value so much. And you mentioned the fall, right? So it reached a value of over $19,000, which is absolutely ridiculous. And then it fell down to like $15,000, which that's a pretty big drop, 25%, right? It's rebounded a bit now. I think what is the current value? Actually, it's down right now, 14,500. But it doesn't matter because tomorrow it'll be 17,000, and that's it. So it sounds bad, but the really interesting thing I think we need to highlight for 2017 is the fact that a Bitcoin is worth anything at all, right? And better yet, well over 10,000 American dollars. That is a ton of money for a fake currency that has no real value. I made my opinion kind of plain on this one, but that's definitely something we want to keep an eye on. There's people still trying to figure out why it's gaining in this value, why people all of a sudden have this perceived value. Is it a bubble? If it is, it's going to pop in 2018, so that'll be the big story of 2018. That'll definitely be one to take a look at. But in the tech industry right now, you just can't avoid people talking about Bitcoin one way or another, either the value of it, how it's being used legally and illegally, how blockchain works. That really is one of the bigger tech stories to come out of the last year.
Yeah, and I know that's something we've talked about doing in 2018 is, hopefully maybe we'll get Duncan back in here, but dig a little bit more into the technology behind Bitcoin and talk about blockchain and some of the other uses for it beyond just the buzzwords and things you hear about with Bitcoin.
Yeah, I'll talk bad about it all day, but it's cool technology. Like the blockchain itself can be used for so many different things. It's making it into fake money that I have a problem with. But.
Yeah, and when I was trying to explain this whole Bitcoin thing to my dad over the holiday break, he was born in the Netherlands, and so he told me to go home and Google the tulip bubble, or what do they call it? Tulip something.
I have heard about that. That it was like false scarcity or something.
Bulbs, that people were basically buying the bulbs because I had to go watch a YouTube video to appease my dad. People were basically buying the bulbs, never even taking possession of them, and then selling them where so when the bubble actually burst, there were people that had the expenditure out but didn't have anything in their hand, and likewise there were people that had the bulbs and hadn't paid anything. So it was really interesting stuff, but just goes to show that we are destined to continue to repeat history, and this year's tulips are Bitcoin. So speaking of repeating history, the big theme I've noticed this year in our podcast has been data breaches. And if your data is on the internet or anywhere, or even in your home or in a file cabinet, someone else has it probably. And the big one this year was Equifax, just because they're such a big name and the type of data that they have on you in terms of social security number, all of your payment history for everything ever. That made this one particularly scary. And that was a few months ago, and we haven't heard much about Equifax recently.
Yeah, in getting ready for this show, we picked about 15 different topics that were all big for 2017. And the next couple of ones are all in the security section. And it would have been easy to pick 15 that were just security related. Like there have been so many security related incidents this year. I don't think it's actually different than previous years. It's just they get a lot more press, a lot more communication, which is a good thing. But that news cycle that's out there makes it where it's easy to forget. And so with Equifax, 143 million people, their extremely personally identifiable information completely compromised. Just an inexcusable breach. Really, really bad stuff. Huge news for a solid month. I mean, it was everywhere. And then now we're in this lull. And this has happened before. I was telling Peter before the show that several years ago, RSA had a breach like this where it compromised their hardware tokens. That was really bad. It was in the news for like a week or two and then disappeared, and nobody ever talked about it again. We never did find out the extent of that breach, how many people were affected. They didn't do a whole lot of customer notifications. That was a really, really weird one. With Equifax, what's going on right now is there is an investigation going on. The authorities are involved, and so a lot of this is now being kind of held because it's part of litigation, and so it kind of clamps down on that information. It might be years before we start getting more information out on this one, but it was a huge breach and a big eye opener to a lot of companies. Really said, hey, you got to start paying more attention to the security of your network, which is a great thing because a lot of companies underinvest in that.
Yeah, and the interesting thing to me about the whole Equifax breach was finding out really how far Equifax goes into other lines of business where you'd say, oh, well, I'll just start using this monitoring service or this monitoring service, and then find out they use Equifax for this part and that part. So it's interesting to see when a breach takes place, that breach can reach far beyond what you think it reaches and go into all these other areas where you're potentially kind of stuck then too.
Which gave this whole article a bit of irony, to it that Equifax actually has a breach notification service, and they can help you. They call it their breach services, which I wonder if they used themselves.
Yeah.
So
maybe that's how they
happen.
found out. Yeah, and you're talking about the news cycle this year especially has been kind of crazy. When this first broke, they were just saying, please let the president tweet something today, because all of a sudden the 6 p.m. news would be like, oh, and by the way, we have breaking news coverage. There's a tweet. So speaking of other security stories from this year, ransomware was one of the big ones for sure. I just wrote an article here for ITProTV about ransomware and what you can do to help prevent it or make sure that you're backed up and stuff in case you do get it.
I thought you were going to say what you could do to make it and
how to distribute
it.
Yeah, and really because the big thing is you want to know how many Bitcoin to ask for, and that's the hardest part in your ransoms. Do you wait the 48 hours and see what Bitcoin is worth, and pay the ransom then, or take the risk that it's going to go back up? So people are really getting off the hook easy compared to last week with their ransomware. But the big one we want to talk about was Petya. Is that how it's say it?
Petya. You mentioned the Bitcoins, right? So with ransomware last year in 2016, it was really common for the ransomware to say, hey, all of your files are encrypted, and if you want them, you got to send me 1 Bitcoin. Well, back then, 1 Bitcoin was $300, right? We're talking about over 1,000% growth in value of Bitcoin in the period of a year. And so now, if they tell me my files are encrypted and they want 1 Bitcoin, screw that. That's $17,000. That's a ton of money. So it has really messed with the ransomware monetization model.
Yeah, the whole ransomware industry is just turned on its head. It's tough.
So what was interesting, though, was that ransomware is still out there, except we're now starting to see it be weaponized. And that's really, really interesting. Petya was the first example of that or the first documented example. So in theory, things like Stuxnet were great examples in the past. But with Petya, where it was specifically targeted at an area, it was released in the area of the Ukraine to be able to target systems there and compromise them. Foreign governments and state agencies, they're now at that point where they can craft these types of malware and viruses and specifically target countries, regions, and it might spread, right? Petya ultimately did spread to the entire globe, but it was really focused in one area, and it wasn't just a random distribution. It was a targeted effort. So we're going to see more of that. That cybercrime activity is no longer just the back corner kind of hacker who's trying to make some money. Now it's actually governments and North Korea, Russia, the United States. We're right in there with all of them. We all have cyber warfare units now, and it is now turning into a weapon. So. Cybersecurity for a lot of people was a hobby, like the hackers in the 1980s. Now it's a military career.
Yeah, and I wonder if it targeted the Ukraine. I wonder who could have been behind such a. I wonder what nation.
Albania.
State. Yeah, it's probably Albania.
We'll see.
So I did want to ask though on that. You said that then it spreads from there. So obviously, if I create a ransomware attack and I attack you. I'm just focusing on that attack. How does it spread from there where someone else gets that code and then says, oh, cool, I'm going to use this as well because I know this works? Is that basically?
Yeah. Well, if you think about the Stuxnet attack, right, which that was malware that was introduced to stop Iran's nuclear facilities. So Iran had nuclear facilities. They knew that other people might attack them, so they air-gapped them. They made sure that they were not connected to the internet, that you just couldn't get in. And so whoever whoever crafted Stuxnet, the generally accepted theory is that it's the U.S. and Israel, that whoever made Stuxnet really had to work hard to get that into their network to infect the machines. So they're focused on how can we get that in there to infect those machines, not how can we stop it from spreading anywhere else. And they do escape, right? Especially once the forensics part starts, right? A local police department takes a seized laptop and throws it in their evidence room. Mm-hmm. And then later it gets fired up and connected to the internet to be able to demonstrate something or even collect information.
Sold at auction to you and I.
And now it leaks out. Sold at auction. Some of these attacks now are embedding in firmware and in BIOS, and it can certainly happen. So then they escape out. Petya, it may not have been targeted. Maybe it just happens to be a coincidence. It was just released in the Ukraine and then spread everywhere from there. But even if it was targeted, it's really hard to limit things like that, and they spread. So that's a big problem. Brian Krebs with Krebs on Security, he did a write-up where he kind of went about trying to document the process of how it went global and spread out and tackled everything. It's hard to really identify where it all started, right? And with some of them, you're seeing where they might ask for a Bitcoin, but the payment link is not even valid, or the email address is not valid. And so that's what kind of tells you, hey, they're not trying to make money. This was released for some other reason. And we haven't seen that before. Now we're seeing it.
Yeah, there were probably USB keys just littered all over Iran for people just to pick up with that virus on it. And then they're like, wait, we didn't think about the ramifications here.
Who can pass up a free USB key?
Not me. And I bring it and I always check on Don's computer to see what's on the USB key.
That's why I run OS 2, so that I know, no USB support.
Which version of OS 2 are you running?
All of them.
Okay. All right, so let's switch gears to passing fads and buzzwords, as we're calling this section. And the first one is mobile devices overtaking laptops and desktops. And this is something we've heard about for several years now, how mobile is going to be the future, and it's the future. And you get the statistics from Facebook on the number of views they have on mobile versus other things. But I've always kind of been one of those people that, well, that's great and all, but what can I really? There's things that I can only do on my laptop, and I'm finding it's definitely more and more true. I mean, I know a lot of times on trips you'll only take your iPad Pro. I mean, I guess we're technically considering that a mobile device, even though it looks the same as your laptop when all said and done.
Mobile OS.
But yeah, so we think it's finally there. Would you say?
I would say that the numbers are showing it, right? So, I had a hard time picking topics for this area because there were so many things. I wanted to, like last year. Last year we had threat feeds and advanced persistent threats and machine learning, right? Those are big topics that they were really just buzzwords. And this year we had plenty of buzzwords as well. We had things like AI and machine learning, I guess, was still there, and all these kind of crazy things. The personal assistants, the Google Homes and Amazon Echoes, and all those. All of those things are really just buzzwords. So I wanted to try and find some stuff that was actually documentable. And this one was really neat. A lot of businesses have been fighting the battle against the whole bring your own device movement. But at this point, I think the mobile device stuff has won, or at least gained a big enough foothold that it can't be overturned. And so now, if you're a business, you can't expect your customer to have Windows. You can't expect your customer to have even Mac OS or Linux for that matter. You have to expect a lot of them to be running a mobile operating system like iOS or Android. And Recode had some statistics on their site where for the first time, more people will do their holiday shopping on mobile than on desktop. And they had the numbers. They kind of show it here year over year as it started to grow, right? It's already been a really sizable amount. Even back in 2015, it was a huge amount of people using mobile devices. In 2017, their prediction was 54%, and they haven't pushed the final numbers, but it's certainly accurate. And even myself, I found where there were like Black Friday deals where I didn't go to the store. I just used my phone and I bought it. The Amazon app or the Target app on your phone, and You can do the in-store pickup now. So if I've already paid for it, I just walk into the store, go to the counter, and I get it. That's way better than trying to find an aisle, find an assistant,
And the
all that mess.
fighting all the
Yeah,
people for the TVs.
I
That's
can fight
hard.
whenever I want. I don't have to do it at the store.
Sure, I like to fight on a Saturday or a Sunday, not my Friday after Thanksgiving.
Not at 4 a.m.,
Yeah,
right?
no.
Let's schedule a fight at a
No,
reasonable
it's
time.
good, nice daytime fight. But I actually, for the first time this year, did 100% of my holiday shopping on my mobile device. And
Yeah.
my family is kind of boring. We put everything on Amazon wish lists, and just it's being spread out and not knowing what someone wants necessarily. It's just an easy way. And so I would actually remember I went to lunch. I ordered lunch, sat down, was waiting for it to, because you get your ticket and wait for your number to be called. And I sat there and I went down each person's list and I picked a couple things that looked good, hit submit, and I was done before my food arrived, which isn't a testament to how slow the food was. The food was, on a normal schedule. But I did 100% of my Christmas shopping this year on my phone from Amazon. Shop local. Well, I was shopping local at a deli. So I can check that part off.
And you think about your own usage; it's pretty representative. Here at the office, I use either like I'm on Fedora Linux right now or Mac OS. At home, I've got a Windows machine. So when I'm at these stationary places, I'm using traditional desktop operating systems. But everywhere else, I'm either on my cell phone, which is Android. When I travel, I don't take a traditional device with me. You mentioned that, Peter. I have an iPad Pro or my Chromebook. I use the Chromebook quite a bit. Actually, I haven't used the iPad Pro in a few weeks now. So I do so much on a mobile device, and there's been more than once that I've caught myself sitting right here at my desk, reading an article on my phone when I've got this giant monitor right here, right? It's easy to read, and I'm on this little phone, and I think to myself, why the heck am I looking at this little screen? But I've gotten so used to doing that that I consume most of my news on mobile. And so we're seeing more of that. And I think if they could just solve the keyboard problem, then we're probably at the point where many, many end users are no longer going to need a traditional desktop OS.
You mentioned the Chromebook. Do you consider that? Is that a mobile device?
I consider it that way because it's not a full-blown OS.
Yeah.
I can't there are many people who would disagree
with
me right
fight
now.
On this
it's got
one?
a kernel, it's got RAM, but you can't just install whatever you want on it.
Yeah.
It's very, very limited to the Chrome apps and now Android apps you can run on it. So that's why I consider it mobile. For most people, they don't need a full-blown operating system anymore, and so we are seeing that trend of people moving away from it. Apple has, if you look at we'll talk more about this in the operating system section. I want to get ahead of myself. But in the mobile devices, we have seen so many great leaps and strides, right? With Android 8 came out this year, a lot of new functionality in there. iOS, they just keep cranking out new versions, adding new stuff, new features, and making it easier and easier for people to use those mobile devices for everything. So businesses can't ignore that anymore. You have to plan on your customer. You have to plan on your employees using these mobile devices.
And thanks to Apple and the iPhone 10 now this year, the price of mobile devices has also caught up with the price of your traditional desktop.
I'd say it's well above it. I mean, the iPhone 10 is $1,000.
Yeah, when you consider the processing power per dollar.
Yeah.
I wonder how that would. But it's so pretty. I haven't got it yet. But
you get with a mobile device, and I'll say any mobile. So not just Apple. You get battery life that goes all day. You get really full computing functionality. It's impressive stuff. So really, we're going to continue to see more advancements. But 2017, I mean, it really is the year that people made that switch to mobile OSs.
Now, the other place where I find I'm doing a very similar thing to what you described is I'll be sitting on my couch watching a video on my phone, even when I have the Apple TV that I could sit there and AirPlay it to. But that goes kind of to our next story, which is cable. The cable subscription. I mean, if you were a cord cutter a year ago or 2 years ago, you're a very early adopter, and I'm going to try Sling TV, or I'm going to use exclusively Hulu and Netflix and these kinds of services. But I think we're starting to see this become a mainstream thing at this point, where we're going to have, there's finally some a la carte options that with Sling where you can say, gosh, if I could only have these 4 channels and these live sports and this news, I'd be set and be able to cut the cord. And that's kind of stuff's happening now. That's the kind of the next story we have here.
Yeah, in the United States, when we made the switch to HD television, right, the HD over the air, that meant that you could get a high quality video feed for free for your local channels. And then all these online services have really come a long way as well. Hulu has live TV now. Some of the other platforms started launching live TV. Plex, the free video platform, they have where they can do full DVR functionality with live TV. So you're seeing more and more people cut the cord, and we did. 2017 was the year that the Pizzette household became cord cutters. We use Hulu, Netflix, sometimes Showtime, Anytime, I think is what Vivian uses, and then we just have our own video library. So that has completely replaced our need for cable, and it has been like that across the industry. So Business Insider had some numbers on this one, which you can see here. I mean, these guys are still making a ton of money, right? But for traditional video subscribers, you can see that trend each year, and these last couple of ones here are the ones we really care about because the drop was fairly small, right? Like a 0.4% drop or 0.5% drop, and then it became 1.2%, 1.5%, 3.3% in 2017. That's a drop that is doubling in size each year, and it's only going to get worse. So that market is reinventing itself, and the cable companies are learning, hey, our internet service is more valuable than our video service, which is neat.
Yeah, they're doing fine in this scenario because, like you said, they're already making a lot of money. But if you're switching to go to Hulu and Netflix, you're doing that through, in most cases, the same provider to give you the internet that you were using to give you the cable before, and that's probably I'm not sure. I haven't checked these numbers, but that's probably less expensive for them than the payouts that they're making to the individual stations. Every station, in your cable, you've got 250 channels. They're making a small payment to them when you have cable. With the internet, that's really just the one big payment that they're making.
Well, there is another challenge, though. So you take a channel like ESPN, right? ESPN costs a lot of money for a cable provider to offer. And you hear about cable providers going into these negotiations all the time. Well, if ESPN has their own internet streaming service, which they do, then it almost behooves them to not discount the cable companies, to charge them more, knowing that if the customers don't like it, the customers will come and deal direct with ESPN. They'll probably make more money, right? So I think the cable companies are going to start getting worse and worse deals on syndication or carrying the channels. And you may see more and more of them start to become just internet companies. I'd be curious to see.
And that could be why ESPN offloaded about half of their staff earlier this year.
Oh, did they?
Oh, yeah, big time staff turnover. Part of it goes back to their deal where they basically paid way too much for NFL, because they've got a contract for several years out to broadcast NFL games. Paid way too much for that.
And the players got to eat.
Well, yeah. Well, you saw that chart rising. That's when they made that deal for the NFL, and now it's dipping down, and obviously they're seeing the effects of that. So we have to just watch the games now without commentators, but we can figure out what's going on. It's easy enough. So next up, let's jump to an article that was from the first quarter this year in March, saying wearables are dead. Wearables aren't dead. They're just shifting focus as the market grows 16.9% in the fourth quarter. And that would have been the fourth quarter of 2016, and that's
reported
Christmas
in 2017
time, and everyone's buying their Apple Watches and all that great stuff. So obviously wearables, they're the future.
Yeah, wearables have been a bit of an iffy market, and I'll say, I had an Apple Watch for a while. I didn't get as much utility out of it as I had hoped I could have. I had an Android Wear watch for a while and really did not like it. It just was not functional at all. Like the Apple Watch is significantly better, but neither of them really gave me a ton of functionality. And at the time, the analysts were saying, "Don't worry, this market is just evolving. It's changing who it's targeted to. Initially, it was targeted towards health and fitness." And then it tried to go general, and then it was kind of repositioning after that. So that was the outlook at the beginning of the year. And it's always fun to come back and look at these things later on. TechCrunch had an article just a few days ago. U.S. wearables market is doing much worse than expected. So that means, first off, it means they expected it to do bad, right? Contrary to the numbers from last year. But also it did even worse than they expected. So if you look at the percentage in change here, the percentage in change has been getting smaller and smaller. The population is growing, but the wearable market isn't. And if you think about the advancements that are out there, even if you pick just one watch, pick the most successful one is the Apple Watch, right? So if you look at the Generation 1, Generation 2, Generation 3, functionality-wise, they're not that different, right? They introduced the ability for the watch to operate standalone without a phone, but most people don't do that. It wasn't an issue for most people. Some people it was. But aside from that, by and large, it does the same thing as the very first generation. So you've got a product that's not being adopted very fast, and you've got a product that there's not really a reason to upgrade it other than if yours breaks or if you want it to be a status symbol, like I've got to have the newest one, which only so many people do. The early adopter market is only so large. So wearables, by and large, have failed. That and it's not just watches. Think like what were the Android glasses? The
Google Glass?
The Google Glass, right? Where those things, they weren't socially acceptable, and those got shut down.
Once you see Edward Snowden as the main model of something, it's not a great look.
Yeah. The Fitbit has done reasonably well, so it's been around. The Pebble smartwatch, which was one of my favorites, the Pebble, because it was so inexpensive. They shut down. Motorola or somebody acquired their assets, and then they're just gone now. So this Kickstarter hero from 2 years ago is now gone in 2017. So it was a rough year for wearables. I don't know if they'll recover for next year or not, but in the meantime, I've got the trusty analog watch.
Classic wearable.
I know.
Nice.
And oddly enough, I don't have to shake my wrist to tell the time. Yeah. I can just look, and it's there. It's amazing.
Yeah, but you got to figure out what all those hands mean.
Well, it's an always-on screen, which is beneficial. I don't know. It tells me the date and the time.
Well, this lets me know several times a day that I am not doing nearly enough to stay alive.
Fitbits are great at tracking weight gain. And
Oh my God! I still haven't done anything today. Just double checking in case I forgot about that run I took. Nope, 0 minutes of activity.
There's always tomorrow.
I'm essentially dead. So is our section on buzzwords and fads. But it will be interesting to see how wearables kind of evolve over the next couple of years. Whether they become, back to kind of single. Focus devices like fitness, or one of the big things with the Apple Watch for me is just been its size too. That it's not the most attractive watch. If they can get that thing really thin and a little more a little better form factor.
Maybe that's the problem. Maybe next year instead of wearables, they should be insertables.
All right, so switching gears to cloud technologies. Cloud technology is the next thing we want to talk about. And I actually sent down an article today about Alibaba trying to jump into the Indian market with their own cloud service. So, with the funding they have behind them, they could certainly make a jump. But the first story we have in the cloud technologies is about the rise of Docker. And Docker is something that's been brought up several times on this podcast, as we've talked about. Well, actually, a lot related to AWS and stories coming out of that AWS conference earlier this month. But Docker is kind of one of the great success stories of 2017, I'd say.
If we were filming this at the end of 2016, this would be in the buzzword category. This would be, I'm tired of hearing about containers and Docker. Just release some stable software, and then we'll talk about it. Well, in 2017, they did release some stable software, and it has caught on like wildfire. Almost every developer out there is learning about using Docker and developing in a Docker environment. They may not be deploying their final product in Docker, but they're absolutely using it as part of their dev or sandbox environments. It does a great job for that. Adoption has been through the roof. They had DockerCon this year, bigger than any previous year. Electric Cloud gathered some of the data together from the conference that was released out there. And, there are more than 14 million Docker hosts out in the world right now, more than 900,000 Docker apps, 77,000 growth in Docker job listings. That just shows you how important a skill set this has become. And for a developer, you can't ignore that. you have to say, all right, I work in this space, I develop applications, I need to know how to work inside of Docker. And as a system administrator, you need to know it as well, because if they're running Docker, who's going to have to help? Who's going to have to make sure that it's being secured and protected? And that's a big thing too, is container security is on the rise. So this one's officially moved from buzzword to success story. Docker is going to be here for a while. It will eventually be replaced by something better. But for now, if you're doing a containerized deployment or working in a container environment, the odds are you're using Docker. And even most Linux distros that had LXC or Microsoft, where they had the Hyper-V containers, both of those have switched to doing Docker. Microsoft has direct Docker support in most Linux distros. Some Linux distros don't even have LXC packages anymore. They just have Docker. So they kind of won that battle, the battle between VHS and Betamax. Well, this is Docker versus everybody else, and Docker, I think, has won that one in 2017.
Yeah, and so where does Kubernetes fit in with this? Because that's something that, does that compete directly with Docker?
So it doesn't compete directly with Docker. It competes with Docker Swarm.
Okay.
So Docker by itself is one container, right? So if I have an application, I can run it in this one little box, and it does its job. Well, I can't expose 1,000 people to that one little box. It's not going to be able to handle the load. So I'm going to need more than one of those, more than one container. So how do we orchestrate that? How do we make sure that I can spin out those containers as I need them? Or sometimes I might have one application that actually has multiple pieces, a database, a web application, and a web front end, and it's actually 3 different containers. How do I manage the relationship between those containers? Well, Docker Swarm was the way to do that from the official Docker company. The Kubernetes option was one that was kind of championed by Google, and they were competing products. And for a long time, people just didn't know which one to go with. Like, one was championed by the people that made Docker. That seems like a no-brainer. The other one is championed by Google, a little tech company startup out of California.
Read about them. Yeah, they do the cars, right?
Yeah, and the glasses.
Oh, the glasses people.
So when a company like that puts their weight behind it, you can't go wrong with it either. So which one do you pick? And that was a tough decision at the beginning of 2017. At the end of 2017, it's pretty obvious that Kubernetes won that battle. Even Docker now fully supports Kubernetes. AWS supports it, so I can actually create an orchestration package in Kubernetes locally on my own laptop, and then I can just shoot it right into AWS and deploy the same infrastructure, and off we go. That has taken over. So that was another big winner for the year.
Yeah, and they have a fun conference too, KubeCon, which we've debated the pronunciation of, whether it's KubeCon or KubeCon, because it's Kubernetes. It better be KubeCon, but even their own marketing seems to embrace both. So, yeah. And speaking of cloud stuff, great segue there, Peter. Azure gains market share while AWS plateaus. That was another big story from this year. AWS seemed to be kind of the one really pulling ahead in that big cloud fight over the last couple of years. But I guess they've kind of reached a critical mass. I mean, I know we talked in a podcast earlier this month that AWS was opening some new data centers in Europe, but Azure has definitely seen its fair share of gains as well.
That landscape is changing, right? So at the beginning of 2017, whatever year this is, if you had asked me who are the major cloud providers, if I'm evaluating a cloud solution, who do I need to be looking at? And as far as public clouds go, AWS has been the 600-pound gorilla. You know, they've been the leader of that market. They've had primary market share for quite some time because they got a big head start on everybody else. Google Compute was still a very small market share. Microsoft Azure was making a dent, definitely larger than Google Compute, but way smaller than AWS. And that was kind of the top 3. And we've seen some big changes this year. Gartner did a study and kind of released some numbers on this that Channel E2E published. And so you can kind of see that market share right here, where Amazon has 44% of the market share, a huge chunk. Microsoft only has 7%, right? Which is significantly smaller. You've got Google at 3%, Alibaba at 3%, Rackspace at 2%. Others, I mean, that's anybody else. So that includes some even private cloud offerings. So obviously, Amazon is still the market leader. That has not changed, right? But what's significant here are the growth rates that Amazon had been growing quite a bit as people moved to the cloud. But now people are becoming more comfortable with the other options that are in the market. And there are certain areas where Microsoft is doing a better job with Azure, or Google is doing a better job with GCE. And Amazon, while they have a massive product offering, might not be excelling in certain areas. So if we look at the growth rate on these things, this is the really interesting one, because if you take a look here, Microsoft has grown 61%. Amazon has only grown 45.9%. So Azure, while it is only 7% to Amazon's 44%, Azure is growing faster. And Peter, you mentioned Alibaba a minute ago, 126%. Well, they were practically non-existent in 2016, so it's easy to make giant strides like that. If we see that again in 2018, then Alibaba will be a bigger player. Google doubled in size, 100% growth. That's really massive. Rackspace, 5%. They kind of have their market and are holding it, but not making a lot of big advancements there. And that's partly because they've really doubled down on their investment in OpenStack, and OpenStack just hasn't seen a lot of uptake. So that one's kind of held there. They're focusing more on the hybrid cloud environment, whereas Google, Microsoft, those guys are focused more on the full cloud deployment. So really interesting when you start to look at these growth rates and what we're seeing come out of these providers.
Yeah, and the article I was talking about earlier was saying how Alibaba is opening a cloud center in India. And, that's really one of those markets where maybe there's not a lot of money there for them, but there's a lot of tech companies based there. There's a lot of data that can be there, put there. And there's, obviously a tremendous tech workforce as well. So if you want to see that number continue to rise, making investments like that's going to really help with the billion people there.
One thing I consistently see in the U.S. media is that, at least here in the U.S., it is very easy for us to not think about the Indian market or the Chinese market. That those two countries are very independent, right? They have a very tight-knit culture, and they keep to themselves by and large, right? Well, they are massive countries. China has a population that it's like a quarter of the Earth's population, isn't it? And India is no slouch either. They have a huge population. So it makes sense that if you can do business there, it's not so much about what the economy is like or whether their currency is worth more or less than ours. It's the opportunity to do business, and those are huge growth markets, and it makes sense to jump into those.
Yeah, when I look at data as far as social networks go, when I'm doing my day-to-day job, I'll see things like Weibo and say, what is this? Why is this showing up in the list of top social media sites? And I forget, China, because that's what they're on. And so as a result, they're as big or bigger than Facebook in certain categories. So definitely something to think about, because that's a lot of data and it's got to go somewhere.
I'm pulling this up real quick. So according to Google, so this is my fact checking here, the U.S. population is 324 million as of 2017.
All right, we're number one.
China, 1.379 billion. They have a billion more people than we do. Like, that's how much larger that country is. India, 1.3 billion. Both India and China dwarf the United States as far as market share. So, something to keep in mind when you hear about these countries that are branching out in those markets. Those are massive markets.
Yeah, it is. Well, we've got a lot of catching up to do. So next up, staying in the cloud, 40% of all Microsoft Azure VMs now run Linux, and that's something we just talked about recently, right? That's something they just recently opened up. Definitely seen some growth.
This is more of like Satya Nadella, when he took over as CEO of Microsoft from Steve Ballmer. He is doing something different than what we've seen in the past, which is he's been embracing open source. And Microsoft has been making big strides in that area and making it available. When they launched Azure, they easily could have said, we only support Windows VMs. But they've worked out agreements. They've got where you can do Red Hat VMs, you can do Ubuntu VMs. They've got a few other platforms that are supported now. You can even do FreeBSD VMs now inside of Azure. And at the beginning of the year, there was a really surprising news flash or whatever. I think it was in April, where they said it was 27% of VMs in Azure were actually Linux VMs. that was significant. I mean, that's almost a third of the VMs. Well, towards the end of the year, I think it was in October, they came out and said, now it's 40%. So it's growing 40%. You know, almost half the VMs in Azure are Linux-based. And it is a big trend in the server space that Linux has always dominated the server space for a long time. So that's not new. But inside of these cloud services, they normally like to pick one or two OSs and stick to it. And with Azure, to see them doing this, it's really cool. You know, I think about how it used to be that if you wanted to deploy a web application, a lot of things were deployed on FreeBSD. Services like Hotmail were entirely built on BSD. And when Microsoft acquired Hotmail, they spent the first year porting all of that over to run on Windows servers with IIS as the web server. Well, I don't think they'd do that today. Today, they would say, all right, it's going to run on FreeBSD. That's how we'll stick with it. They've been doing things like open sourcing the .NET framework to be able to support Linux and even Mac OS. Just a lot of movement like that. I wouldn't be surprised if next year we start to see a Microsoft Linux, like their own distro. It would make a whole lot of sense. And it used to be that people were always saying, when is it going to be the year of the Linux desktop, right? I don't know that that's going to happen, but it has already been the year of the Linux server for many years, and the Azure growth kind of shows that.
Yeah, and this you are certainly not representative of the general population, but this is the year you switched over to a Linux laptop as kind of your main
my full-time one.
Your full-time machine.
I usually rotate between. I was on a Mac for the last 2 years as my main machine, so. I like to alternate, but I like to learn different OSs, so I'll run all sorts of things. But you know, Linux itself, it has become more and more polished over the years, and you know, desktop and server are really two different beasts. On the server side, it's all about stability and running rock solid. And so when you're running like Red Hat Enterprise Linux on a server, you know it's going to run, you know it's going to be stable. On a desktop, things like that aren't as good because they have older kernels, older libraries. They can't run the latest software. So stability is kind of a second place to features. And that is a tough thing because if you give people an unstable desktop, they're not going to be happy with it. So we still see Windows dominating the desktop market. That's not going to change anytime soon, except for all the mobile OSs that are coming in. So all of a sudden, the Windows versus Mac OS argument, I think, is going to go away, right? But for right now, you still see a lot of Windows Server development, just not in the cloud because the licensing and the expense. If you auto scale with Windows Server, dealing with the licensing is just frustrating versus with Linux where it's free.
And I don't know much about this, but I remember when we talked about Kali Linux a few weeks ago, that we talked about how it is able to run on mobile devices. Is that something you think we're going to see more of with people running Linux on mobile devices?
Certainly. Technically, anybody who's running Android is already running Linux on their mobile OS, right? Android is not Linux. It does run the Linux kernel.
Okay.
So it is very, very similar. Chromebooks are running Linux, and that's why Android apps are able to run on top of Chromebooks now because they've got that compatibility layer. So we definitely see that. Samsung. So my phone is a Samsung Galaxy S8. They had this DeX feature where I can drop my phone into a dock and it will come up and I can use a monitor and keyboard and it's a full-blown desktop. Mm-hmm. Well, they're beta testing right now where you can actually have a Linux distro running right on the phones. Now it's a full-blown version of Linux. I think we'll see that, but 2017 also marked the year that Ubuntu killed their mobile plans, right?
Is that Unity?
And it's tied to Unity. Yep.
Okay.
So I guess
this is our next story, actually. So that's a beautiful segue that I set you up for. But switching to operating systems, Ubuntu Unity is dead. Desktop will switch back to GNOME. That's the one headline in this entire rundown that I understood like three of the words in, and they were and dead and will. So help me in this one.
All right. So Ubuntu has kind of arisen as being the most popular Linux distro for workstations. For servers, they've still got a ways to go, but for workstations, they've definitely kind of capitalized on that. And they've done a good job. I'm not the biggest fan, but they certainly have done a good job with it. A couple of years ago, they made a controversial decision and decided to switch their desktop environment to one called Unity. And Unity was designed to work on any sized screen. So a full-size laptop, a big screen TV, or a mobile phone. And what they figured was If we can get it to support any size screen, now you can have one OS on your mobile, on your laptop, on your desktop, on your embedded devices. It can all share one operating system. It's a lofty goal. It didn't do so well. The Linux mobile phones that they released, I forget what they were called. I think it was called like the Ubuntu phone or something like that. Not too exciting. It didn't sell very well. Got a lukewarm reception. The people who did buy it were total zealots. I mean, they loved it, but there just weren't enough of them. So, it didn't do well. And so this year, Canonical made the decision, we're gonna stop supporting Unity. So they're not putting any more development dollars into Unity. And instead, they are going back to GNOME, the desktop that pretty much everybody else runs, to basically make sure that the users get the experience that they want. But it effectively killed the Ubuntu phone, which was probably the Linux phone that had the most promise.
Well, let's actually jump ahead a story then, because it kind of is a good segue. But another phone that's essentially dead is the Windows Phone. And I will say I had a Windows Phone back in the day. And, at the risk of sounding like a Microsoft fanboy, I really, really enjoyed it. I think if all other things were equal, and all other things being equal means the App Store, if the App Store was equal across all those devices, I would take a Windows Phone operating system any day. Now, this was at the time compared to where iOS was then, where Android was then. I'd need to reevaluate now, because that was a few years ago. But did you have a Windows device? Windows mobile?
I did, but not the current generation.
Okay.
Right? I guess we had a test device here that I messed with. But as far as something I actually used, it was a long time ago, back in the Palm Trio days.
Yeah.
But you're not the first person I've heard that from. That people who use the Windows mobile platform really did like it. And if you used your phone as a phone, they worked really well. The call quality was good. The user interface was very fluid and easy to get to what you wanted. Texting and email were straightforward and simple. What did them in was the App Store. And Microsoft admitted this. They came out and they said, look, we've tried everything we can do to get Windows Mobile to take. And if you look at their history, they certainly have tried. It came a long way from the old Windows CE, which is what it started as, and moved through all of its iterations through the Palm days, and then moving on to the ridiculous name they gave it in Windows. It was Windows 7 Phone Series, like it's just the dumbest name possible, to Windows 10 Mobile, and it just didn't take. And the problem was the App Store, and that's more than likely what was killing the Linux phones as well. It is difficult, really difficult to launch a new platform today with no apps. And so what Microsoft said in their admission, they said, look, we tried everything. We tried paying people to write apps.
The place where I used to work, we built apps for the Microsoft phone marketplace, and were paid to do it by Microsoft.
They said that they even tried writing the apps for people. Where I think it was
sign off on this one.
Was it Facebook? It was somebody big.
Yeah.
Where they said they weren't going to release an app for Windows Mobile, and so Microsoft said, "What if we write it for you? We'll do all the work."
Yeah.
And they said even then, companies just didn't care. Like, why would we put work in for this phone that doesn't even have 1% of the market share? And so everybody saw it. It was just it was dying on the vine. And when internal Microsoft employees started to resist and say, boy, I'd really like an iPhone, or I'd really like an Android phone, that was the writing on the wall. And so now Microsoft has kind of pivoted and said, all right, we can't be successful in that market. So instead, let's make our products run on the mobile devices. And I'll tell you, Microsoft Office on Android and Microsoft Office on iOS runs really well. Skype for Business, they both do really well on the mobile platforms. So that adoption that's happened has really worked out well for them. That doesn't mean they won't try and get into this market again. But this last time, I mean, Windows 10 Mobile was a failure. It did not get high.
They went all in. Yeah, they definitely went all in and failed. I mean, they were at the point where they were giving each Microsoft employee, here's your mobile device, and here's your Surface, and they were still going out and buying an iPhone or an Android device.
Yeah, and their acquisition of Nokia turned out to be like almost a total write-off, or Nokia, I think I said it wrong. That they
Depends on where you are.
I guess so. So that acquisition didn't go well. They lost a ton of money there. So all real eye openers on that one. We'll see what happens down the road. We might see a Microsoft phone again in the future, but it might just be running Android, or they might try and launch something and kind of capitalize on that App Store. But I think where they need to be worried, and this will be like a prediction for next year, right, is that if people are increasingly moving away from desktop OSs and Microsoft doesn't have a mobile OS that is worthwhile, Microsoft's big claim to fame is that on the desktop side, they have more apps than anybody. They have more programs that run natively on Windows than anybody else, and it's easy to use, and it's stable, and they've got hardware drivers, and it's great, right? But if people's need for that is going away, the Windows operating system itself could become irrelevant in the next few years. And they've got to have something to pivot to. Well, they've got Azure that does that. They've got Xbox, their successful gaming unit. So they've got other things for the company. Microsoft Office will continue to be an amazing product, but I fully expect to see more Microsoft products getting ported over to run on Android or to run on Mac OS and Linux. I think we'll see more and more of that as Microsoft themselves looks at it and says, hey, the Windows operating system may not be relevant for too much longer.
Yeah, and just to kind of look back at this and put some numbers to it, this is from an old article, so this is 2014 from CNET, when the Windows Store had the benchmark of hitting 300,000 apps. And at that same time, Apple had 1.2 million apps. And so you were having to do things on your in your browser, basically on the phone, that other people were able to do in a native app that was a much better experience. But going back to what you said, and Microsoft putting their products into different environments kind of brings us to our last story there. Microsoft brought SQL Server to Linux, which, I mean, that's a huge deal if you told someone that 3-4 years ago, and that happened in 2017.
Absolutely, and they announced they were going to do it in 2016, but they actually did it in 2017. So I threw it in here. This is a big deal because Microsoft SQL Server, their database server, is one of their cornerstone products, one of their oldest products. It came out in the 1980s and has evolved a lot. And databases are so critical to organizations these days that this product is just really, really important. Well, for them to release a version of it that runs on top of Linux, that right there shows that separation of, what if we don't have the Windows operating system underlying? What if somebody's deploying in the cloud and they're using Linux servers because they're better supported and they're easy to scale, and now they can't use SQL Server, right? So now they've double lost a customer. What if they could retain at least the SQL Server side, which is where they make a lot of money? At Microsoft, they consider their successful products the ones that have generated more than $1 billion in revenue. And SQL Server did that a long time ago. Other products like SharePoint only did it a few years ago, but they're newer products. It takes time to get to that point. SQL Server's already there. I think we're going to see more of Microsoft Server services, things like Microsoft Exchange or even the Active Directory, start to become containerized or able to be deployed on a different operating system like this. And those are products that Microsoft does an amazing job with. Microsoft's Active Directory is really, really good. And if you are a total Microsoft hater and you love Linux and LDAP is your best friend, technologies like OpenLDAP, they're pretty fickle. They're really easy to break. They have a lot of functionality, but they're very easy to break. Microsoft's Active Directory, it's very stable, and it has even more functionality, like group policy objects and things of that nature. The multi-master replication, it's really impressive technology. If they could bring that to other platforms, that'd be something really special. I think we'll see more of that since we're already seeing them do it on the mobile platforms. It makes sense to do it on the server side too. And I kind of already feel that Windows Server it's already irrelevant. If somebody's going to craft a web application today, they're not going to develop it in Windows. They're going to develop in a Docker container, which is built around Linux. Even Docker containers on Windows are built around Linux. That's how they are. So when you have new development not taking place, it's just a matter of time before people move away from the old stuff and that platform goes away. Windows Server will go away before Windows as a desktop, but I think that writing is on the wall, and Apple's doing the same thing. Apple's OS X server, or Mac OS server, whatever you want to call it, has seen very little change in the last 5 years. And their dev team for Mac OS as a whole has been moved over to their mobile team. And so they're paying very little attention to the desktop OS. We're just not seeing big changes. I think 2018 will be a big shakeup for desktop OSs.
And that said, if you're looking for Windows Server training, we have that at ITProTV. Hundreds and hundreds of hours of courses, because even though it'll be dead, it'll still be used by governments for the next 25 years.
Well, that is true.
It will continue to be a very important part.
Well, and it highlights that for all of us, we need to look back at the year. We need to see how these things progress to figure out what we need to be paying attention to in the next year. And I think it's pretty obvious at this point that if you haven't looked into how to manage mobile devices, if you haven't looked into cloud technologies, these are things that you're not going to be able to ignore in 2018. This is very reminiscent of Novell in the 1990s. That Novell NetWare was the king of enterprise networking in the 1990s. And towards the end, they had products like Novell GroupWise. That was a great product, but that platform was just not user friendly. It just didn't adjust with the times. It had great technology like IPX, SPX. It was a great protocol, but it just didn't stay current with the changing needs with the internet generation. And now we're seeing this cloud generation, and the way I see it is Microsoft is making moves to keep themselves going and being a leader, whereas Novell didn't, and now Novell's kind of a footnote.
Yeah. And well, I definitely think we have some good predictions to pull out of this episode too. So when we do that 2018 year in review, I'll be able to go back and pull clips of Don saying, the most important thing to look for is, get your Bitcoins in now, folks.
Who would ever need more than 640K of memory?
Yeah, it's just ridiculous. Yeah. You need a whole plane to carry that kind of memory. But a lot of great stories from 2017. Great year for us, and great year for people to just get your data. Apparently, that was the other big story. Everyone taking our data. But that's going to do it for us, and we'll definitely be back in 2018, kicking off next week with the news of. I think we got CES coming up and a lot of other conferences that really start to hit in the beginning, the first quarter of 2018. So a lot of great news will be coming out of that. But for now, it's going to do it. So please take a moment to subscribe, share, like this, review it. We love reviews. It helps us kind of move up in the rankings on the various podcast marketplaces. So please take a moment to do that. So, Don, any closing thoughts?
No, it's been a great year for most everybody, unless you got infected with ransomware. So, just stay on top of it. Pay attention to security in the upcoming year. Make sure that you try and put some perspective on everything. Don't necessarily believe all the hype around products or all the sensationalism around the security alerts that are out there. Just look at it, read it, understand it, and stay safe.
Sounds good. All right. With that, we'll go ahead and wrap up. So we'll see you next time.